Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for listening. My name is Jenna Raheb, and I'm a physical therapist. And today I'm going to be talking to you about the equipment ordering process. So, having an understanding of what the equipment ordering process is and the questions to ask along the way is going to be how you're going to make sure that you get the right piece of equipment and the piece of equipment that fits you well and meets your needs. So, I've been helping people with getting equipment for a little over 10 years now. And I've heard other people explain the process many times. And usually the explanation, which is usually, a couple minutes in the course of a PT visit or a physician visit, is they say, you meet with a vendor and you meet with a physical therapist. They help you decide on your piece of equipment and they design it with you. And then the PT writes a letter, the vendor orders it through insurance, and then it gets delivered several months later. And even though that is part of the process, there are some major parts of the process before that, during that, after that, that typically aren't described. And then they're oftentimes skipped. And I think that they're really important parts of the process that need to happen in order to make sure that you get the right piece of equipment. It does happen where corners are cut, steps are skipped, and then people end up with the wrong equipment, or maybe it's the right equipment that doesn't fit them well and then they can't use. So, if you break down the whole process, I like to think of it in these three phases. So, there's a first phase where you're picking the piece of equipment. Then you're also, so you're, I'm sorry, you're finding the right provider for you. And then that provider is going to help you decide on the piece of equipment that you're going to order. The second phase is ordering the equipment. Then that third phase is the delivery of equipment, and then all the things that come after that. So today I'm going to go in detail describing all of these steps, the questions to ask along the way, and then I'll end with also some other things to think about and some common issues that are happening in the equipment industry that I think that are just important to know if you're going through the process. So first, a little bit about me. So my name is Jenna Raheb. Like I said, I'm a physical therapist. I'm My career is mostly clinical, part academic. So I have an outpatient practice that's based out of Medfield, Massachusetts. I offer outpatient in-home as well as telehealth services. I also have a wheelchair and adaptive equipment clinic. I also teach at Boston University. So I teach the pediatrics course there, and I also have helped out with some of the other courses there as well. But primarily, most of what I'm doing is the clinical work, working with patients and working with families. And I work with both kids as well as young adults. My wheelchair and adaptive equipment clinic, though, is open to the pediatric and the adult population. So, when I'm talking about this process, there's certain kinds of equipment that I am referring to specifically. So, I am talking about this process is referring to getting equipment for your high ticket items, right? Your very durable, expensive, very custom pieces of equipment. So things like manual wheelchairs, power assist devices, gait trainers, standers, adaptive car seats. Those are the types of equipment that I'm talking about when I refer to this equipment ordering process. I am not talking about things like, the crutches that you use if you hurt your ankle and you can't put weight on your ankle, or the $150 wheelchair that you can buy on Amazon, right? I'm talking about these more complex, much more expensive pieces of equipment. I also want to start by emphasizing that this is a multidisciplinary process. So it's very common that if a physical therapist, and depending on the piece of equipment, sometimes it's an occupational therapist, sometimes it's a speech therapist, right? But in general, it is very common that the physical therapist is the one who's overseeing everything and is the person who is your point person along the way. However, there needs to be room for everybody's opinion, right? So whenever someone comes to me for equipment, I always make sure that I have contact with their physician. I make sure I have contact with other members of their team. So if there's another physical therapist, another occupational therapist, right, that I'm making sure that I hear their opinions and making sure that their questions get answered, their concerns get voiced. Also, patient and caregivers are also part of this team. I've seen it happen where patients end up with equipment that doesn't work for them. And then they come to me and they say, this isn't what I had wanted and this isn't working for me. And I think it's because no one asked me what I needed along the way, right? So you are part of this process. You are very much part of this process, and I think that you are the most important part of this process, right? So, um, it's it's so important that there's room for everybody's opinions and everybody's concerns, and there's communication among the entire team. And if that's not happening, you definitely need to speak up and voice that concern. So this is really where I firmly believe that the process starts is finding a provider and finding the right provider that is best for you, right? And the provider that's best for you isn't necessarily the provider that's best for somebody else, right? But it's really important not to cut this corner. And I think that this is the corner that gets cut very often because people will just go to, who's local, who's convenient, or who takes their insurance, right? And they'll just kind of pick somebody. And then if it's not the right fit, um, then they don't get the support that they need from beginning to end because it wasn't the person that was the right fit for them. So I always recommend starting here. Take the time, do the legwork. It'll pay off to really get to know what your options are and then pick the provider that's best for you. So first, I always recommend starting with your list. Like, find your list, figure out who in your area is going to be able to help you with getting the piece of equipment that you need. So there's a few ways, a few common ways. There are other ones as well, but I think that these are the common ways, right, that you can start to create your list of providers. So it's very common that the physician is the point of referral when you need equipment. So sometimes, right, you're in a doctor's office and you or your child needs a wheelchair. The physician might be the one who identifies it and refers you to get a piece of adaptive equipment. And sometimes physicians will give you the list. They'll say, okay, where do you live? Here are the people near you, and they'll hand this list to you. But sometimes, and clinicians do this often, right? Where they'll, look at, say, where you live, or they'll make a judgment call as to what they think is the most convenient for you, and they'll give you the name of one person. All very, very well intended, and they don't necessarily give you the list. And so sometimes you do have to ask, and you have to say, I thank you very much for the referral and for this PT's name, but what are my options, right? What are all my options in this area? Another Another very effective way is word of mouth. So the power of the Facebook parent groups is wild. If you are in any disability groups or parent groups, and you can comment, and you can comment anonymously in them too if you don't feel comfortable, and say, this is the scenario. I'm looking for this type of piece of equipment, and I'm looking for a provider who can help me order it. What is your experience? And people can give you names of therapists. Ask your friends, ask other equipment users that you know, and ask who they went through and what their experience was. That's a great way to add providers to your list. And then another really effective option can be Google. Now, I always recommend using Google, but I always say Google shouldn't be your only option. There are a lot of practices, right, that spend a lot of money on search engine optimization that will help them with showing up on page one. There's a lot of people who will do a lot to their website to have good search engine optimization and show up on page one, but not everybody is doing that. So I'm not saying that Google is a bad app. Google's great, definitely use it, but just know that a Google search should not be your only way of finding a provider. And then once you have created that list of providers, take the time and reach out and ask them these questions. And some of these questions might not make sense now as to why you're asking them, but then when I finish talking about the process, you'll have a better understanding of why I'm telling you to ask some of these questions. But call them, get the therapist on the phone and ask. And there are other questions that you might ask as well. You really want to ask what's important to you. And if some of these questions aren't important to you, you might not ask them those questions. But this is an idea. This is just a suggestion of a list of questions that you could ask, right? So for one thing, what is their experience? If they don't have a ton of experience, that's okay, right? But ask, what is their mentoring and their support system if the therapist doesn't have experience with ordering equipment? What does the process of ordering equipment look like through them? They should be able to very clearly explain to you from start to finish, right, what that equipment ordering process looks like. What is the turnaround time for letters of medical necessity and ordering equipment, right? Going through insurance takes a long time, but writing a letter of medical necessity should be a pretty quick thing that should happen in less than a week's time in most scenarios. What follow up care do they offer? What vendors do they work with? And I'll explain who the vendor is a little bit later in this presentation. How frequently do they communicate with physicians and providers? Like I said, the multidisciplinary approach is very important here. So you need to make sure that they are frequently communicating with other providers. Is the same therapist who does the eval present for delivery? So this is a question that I would actually start. I know that, some of this stuff, like I said, you may or may not ask. This, I think, is a really important one. You want to make sure that the physical therapist who's helping you in the beginning is the same physical therapist who is there for delivery. So that way, it's the same person who is problem solving through what to get and what you need on that chair is there to make sure that everything is carried over on delivery. I also recommend not starting with, do you take my insurance? Um, so if you start with, do you take my insurance, you're going to limit the number of providers that you can see. And just because a provider doesn't take insurance doesn't mean that you can't use insurance. So there's a lot of physical therapists, occupational therapists, speech therapists now, right, who are now not contracting with insurance just because of how difficult it has been for rehab therapists to contract with insurance companies. However, it doesn't mean you can't use your insurance. You would just use your insurance in a different way and a different avenue. And I'll tell you, if you have work with a physical therapist who doesn't take insurance, they can coach you on what questions to ask your insurance company to figure that process out before you even start working with them. Also know that just because the physical therapist doesn't take insurance, it doesn't mean that the vendor is the person who is actually going to be ordering the piece of equipment that you're getting. They it doesn't mean that they don't work with insurance. So you could find a PT who doesn't take insurance, but still be going through insurance um, to purchase that piece of equipment. But whoever you talk to, if they don't take insurance, they'll be able to walk you through and explain how to go about doing it. And also they can explain to you, they'll know what is in their area when it comes to other sources of funding for their service. So you definitely want to ask that question. I'm not saying don't ask that question, but I wouldn't start with, do you take my insurance? And if they say no, hang up. Still ask these other questions and then end with this question, and have a conversation about how you'll be paying for their service as well. And then when you hang up the phone, I recommend taking a moment, right, to ask yourself, right, how did that conversation go? These are some pretty basic questions for a physical therapist or an occupational therapist, right? These are some pretty basic questions for a therapist to answer. And if you feel like you didn't get support with answering just some very basic questions, that's a red flag. So you should hang up the phone feeling good about the conversation, feeling like you learned something, feeling like you have a sense of that provider's style, right, and how they go about getting equipment, and have a good sense of, all right, is that going to work for you? So then, once you've gone through this process and you've picked the provider, the physical therapist who's going to help you with your piece of equipment, that's when you need to figure out what you're looking for. I strongly encourage you to be very clear in what your goals are for the equipment that you are looking for. So, for example, right, if you need a wheelchair, right, make sure that you're not just saying, okay, we need a wheelchair, but talk about what are your goals for use of that wheelchair? Where are you going to be taking that wheelchair? What environments are you going to be in? Are you going to school? Are you going to work, right? Really being specific about what your goals are, especially because it's very common that someone might want a piece of equipment and it turns out they actually need a couple of things, and being able to voice what you are looking for and what your goals are is going to be helpful with determining what pieces of equipment that you need, and then your therapist is going to do a better job guiding you as to what you need. It's also so important that you have the opportunity to trial what you're ordering. There are lots of pieces of equipment where there are no exceptions to this rule. If you are getting a manual wheelchair, you should be able to get in multiple different manual wheelchairs to try different ones, try different sizes, be able to see, touch, see, feel, use different accessories. Same thing with power assist devices, gait trainers, standers. And when I say wheelchairs, I mean both manual and power wheelchairs. There's no exceptions. You should have the opportunity to try things before you buy it. So never let anyone pressure you to purchase one of those things without trying it first. Also, trying it is such an important part of the experience because oftentimes you do not know what's going to work for you or your child unless you have the opportunity to try it. So that is such an important piece when it comes to picking the piece of equipment. There are some exceptions to this rule. So something like hospital beds, it's really hard to get trials of hospital beds. They're big pieces of equipment, but fortunately they're somewhat simple pieces of equipment where if you are very specific about what your needs are, and a physical therapist can ask a lot of questions to help figure out what is the best hospital bed choice for you. Throughout the trial process, right, as you are problem solving through trying different pieces of equipment, your therapist should be giving you a lot of education on what your options are, what they recommend, how to use the equipment, how to transfer into and out of it, right? There's a lot of education that comes with that as well. And then also during this process, this is when a physical therapist is going to connect you with a vendor. So you need to go through a vendor to get a wheelchair. So the vendor is the company that contracts with insurance. You're also going to be working with someone called an assistive technology professional. The assistive technology professional works for the vendor, right, this company, and they're going to help you with problem solving through the insurance piece. They can help you get trials. They're also going to be the ones where once it's delivered, if you need repairs, almost all the time, the vendor is going to be the one who's going to be responsible for helping you with repairing parts, right? Because, no matter how good of a piece of equipment that you get, things happen, things break, right? So they're going to be helping you with the repair piece as well. So it's very important to have a vendor on board, right? So physical therapist is going to help connect you with a vendor. Then, once you've figured out what you want, and you don't necessarily need to know exactly what you want, but at least knowing that you want, say, a particular drive system for a power chair, maybe that you want a manual chair, you could be torn between a couple of different frame types or brands, but when you get to a point where you've narrowed down kind of what you need, right? Then you can meet with your physical therapist who's been there to help you throughout the process so far. You're going to meet with the vendor, and then the patient is going to be there. Any caregivers, right, are going to be there, all at the same time to make a final decision on what the equipment is. You're going to make the final decision on the piece of equipment that you're ordering, but you're also going to decide on all the accessories and how these accessories are going to be put on the chair. I cannot emphasize enough. You should be part of the conversation. When you get to this session where it's the PT, the vendor, the patient, and the caregivers, right? And you're making these final decisions, it should not be PT and vendor having a back and forth conversation while you're sitting there just watching them. You should never feel like you're at the mercy of the people who know it more, right? You should be part of the conversation. If conversations are happening and you're not being included and you don't know what's going on, speak up. You have to say something. You absolutely should be part of the conversation. When it comes to getting equipment, I use the car dealership analogy often, right? Where I'll say, I explain that when you get a car, right, you don't just show up to a dealership and say, I want a car, right? And the dealership that, the salesperson doesn't just look at you and say, okay, well, you should get this car of this make and this model, but you pick the color, right? That's not how that goes. You do some research, you test drive some cars, right? There's this the back and forth conversation that you have about have with the salesperson, right? And they can help you with making your decision, but ultimately you make the final decision. That's how it should be with getting a piece of adaptive equipment. You are part of the process, you are making final decisions. Now you have your support team there, right? And this is another reason too why it's so important to not skip that early step and find the provider that's best for you, because they're going to be the ones who are going to be educating you so that you can make these decisions. And then when you're stuck, they can help you with figuring out the final decision. But ultimately, right, you are part of this process. And no, the amount of education that you do to buy your car might not be the same education or the same amount of education that, I want to get my car. You might try more cars, you might test drive more cars than I test drive, and that's okay, right? You have to do what works best for you so that you can feel good about your decision and get the right car. Same thing when it comes to equipment. And again, I'm going to emphasize the multidisciplinary approach, right? Everybody's opinion should be voiced here. And then also, you should, when you get to this point where you're making these final decisions, you should be allowed to have the time and the space that you need to make a decision, and you should never feel rushed. I'll use an example. A couple months ago, I had someone in my clinic, and we were getting a bath chair for them. And even though we had already seen a demo, we had lots of conversations about bath chairs. There's a lot of education up front. When it came time to that appointment, this appointment that I'm describing, we're all in the same place and we're meeting. I could feel a little angst. I could feel that mom had a little bit of angst in what she was trying to decide, right? And so I was the one who stepped up and said, listen, we don't have to make any final decisions today. Do you want to go home and just think about it first? And she said, you know what? Yeah, actually, I would love that. And then, we still, while we were all there to not increase the number of appointments that this family had, we designed the bath chair and figured out the measurements and accessories that we get. And then, so that way we had the information. And then mom and patient had the opportunity to go home, think about it, discuss, and then they reached back out a couple of days later and said, okay, we're going to order it. And they just needed a couple of days to think about it. And that's okay. You should never feel like you have to make a snap decision to order a piece of equipment. If you need time to think about something, you're allowed to take time to think about something. Know that if you take time, the more time you take, right, the longer the equipment ordering process is. So I don't recommend going home and having analysis paralysis and stewing on it for 3 months. But if you just need a day or two to sleep on it, that is okay. You were allowed to do that. During that appointment, here are some suggested questions I have to ask your vendor who's going to be ordering this piece of equipment for you. So, for one thing, do you know how much insurance will pay for this equipment? So there should be a conversation surrounding your insurance and what your benefit is, and the vendor can help you there. Um, will this piece of equipment will getting this piece of equipment through insurance impact my ability to get other pieces of equipment? So this is something that comes up often, and this is something I'd make the argument is this is a question that should happen very early in the process. But if it hasn't happened, if it hasn't been explained earlier on, make sure that you're asking it now. And the example I'm going to give is adaptive strollers and wheelchairs. It's very common that insurance companies, if they get you an adaptive stroller for your child, and then a couple years later you want a wheelchair, they might not pay for the wheelchair because they got you an adaptive stroller. So getting an adaptive stroller can impact the ability to get a wheelchair. Now, I'm not saying don't get an adaptive wheelchair. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is you need to have conversations surrounding what your goals are, both short term and long term, because if the goal is you're going to start with an adaptive chair and then transition to a wheelchair, then there needs to be a conversation because insurance may not support that. So it might make sense to go right to the wheelchair. It might make sense to start with an adaptive stroller. It might make sense to figure out different funding sources. Whatever the decision is, that conversation needs to happen because you don't want to put yourself in a situation where you get an adaptive stroller and then a year or two later want a wheelchair and then say, oh wait, I wish I had known that insurance wasn't going to pay for the wheelchair if we got the adaptive stroller, because then I wouldn't have gotten the adaptive stroller, right? So you always want to be thinking in advance. And this is something that your PT and your vendor should be educating you on very early in this process. Ask the vendor how they handle repairs, right? If something breaks, what do you do, right? How do they handle it? What is their system? Approximately when can I expect delivery to happen? I recommend asking this question and getting an understanding of how long this process is going to take. And then I would also ask what if the date of delivery impacts insurance coverage. Okay, so this is very commonly an issue at the end of the year. Right, so sorry about that. I had to pause the recording for a moment. So another question I'd ask is, does the date of delivery impact insurance coverage? So this is something that is more common an issue at year end, right? So with a lot of people have insurance plans where they have deductibles where they have to meet a deductible before insurance chimes in and pays for things. So if you've met your deductible and you know you could be in a situation where, for example, if the equipment is delivered by December 31st, it's going to get paid in full. But if it's after December 31st of that year, you're going to have to pay at least the 4,000, 5,000, right? Whatever your deductible is. So I would ask that question, even if you're not close to year end, even if it's the summer and you're doing this, I would still ask this question because if there's a point of hold up and it takes some time, it's still good to know if the date of delivery is going to impact your insurance coverage. So just make sure you have that information before you order the equipment. So then from there, once you have that session, what'll happen is so during that session, right, you pick your piece of equipment and all the accessories, right? That's going to go on that piece of equipment. So the vendor then provides the therapist with what we call a spec sheet, and it's basically a list of all the different parts of that piece of equipment. So, for example, if you're getting a wheelchair, right, the first thing will be the type of wheelchair that you're getting, and then literally every little piece that goes on that wheelchair will go on that list. And then the physical therapist uses that list to write their letter of medical necessity. So when the PT writes the letter of medical necessity, basically what's in that is there'll be some background information, some history information about the patient. There's going to be information about their, what impairments they have, what their functional status is, right? There's also going to be a section that explains why the patient needs that piece of equipment, right? They're going to justify why it is medically necessary for them to have that piece of equipment. Then the PT uses that spec sheet. They're going to list out everything that's on that spec sheet, and they're going to justify every single little part that goes on that piece of equipment. So for example, if you're getting a wheelchair, like when I write a letter of medical necessity for a wheelchair, I have to justify the need for the wheelchair, but I also need to justify why they need the wheels, why you need a seat cushion, why you need a backrest. And it seems so obvious sometimes, some of these parts, but you really need to justify every single little part. And this is why PTs typically don't have a 24-hour turnaround time for the letter of medical necessity, because this takes a while. But also, it's why it's a good question to ask in the beginning, because if it takes a PT a month to write a letter of medical necessity, then you're adding a month to the process, right? So the PT is going to write that letter of medical necessity. The PT is going to send their letter back to the vendor. The vendor is then going to send that letter as well as a script to the referring to the physician, right, who's going to be signing off on everything. And then they'll also ask the physician for some medical documentation. And then the physician signs off on everything, goes back to the vendor, and then the vendor submits to insurance. And so this is the common process that is required in order to submit through insurance. There are some insurances now who aren't doing prior authorization. So what'll happen is they don't give you that approval before the equipment is delivered. And so your vendor might say to you, we have to deliver the equipment before, we get the approval from insurance. And if that's the case, you definitely want to have a conversation surrounding, what is the likelihood that this gets covered, and how much is the equipment going to be if it doesn't get covered, so that way you have an understanding of the risk is, right, of having to pay out of pocket, and if that's the case, how much that piece of equipment would be. So then, if you're going through insurance and insurance approves, right? So with this process I was just describing, typically, right, when an insurance company does do prior auth, right, and you're going to go through this process and you're getting insurance approval first. Once insurance approves, then the vendor is going to order the equipment, and then the vendor or the PT will reach out to schedule delivery. Then on delivery, the physical therapist, right, or maybe occupational therapist or speech therapist, depending on the piece of equipment that you're getting. The therapist who did the evaluation should be there for delivery whenever possible. So that way the PT who was there for the eval and to help problem solve through everything is there to make sure everything is carried over on delivery and help make sure that there's proper follow-up. The equipment should absolutely fit the patient, right? So when don't sign for anything until if the equipment's for you, you get in it, or if it's for your child gets in the piece of equipment, and you make sure that everything is fit to the patient, right? Part of delivery, and I always explain this to families, there's another reason why the physical therapist needs to be there, is part of delivery is now making sure, all right, are all the accessories in the right spot? Are they all lined up properly? Do we need to make any adjustments, right? If you get a wheelchair, for example, it's a frame with accessories on it, but those accessories move around, and you can change the orientation, the angles of different things, and you want to make sure that everything is in just the right spot. If you have questions, make sure that you ask them, right? This is another opportunity for you to ask more questions. Now, training on how to use the equipment should have been done right prior to ordering, but usually it takes a few months. If you're going through insurance, it can take some time to get equipment. So it's normal to forget things, right? And need to kind of dust out the cobwebs. So make sure that training is done, right, on how to properly use the equipment, so that when you get the equipment, you know how to use it and you know how to take care of it. Depending on the piece of equipment, this could require some follow-up visits. So for example, if you're a wheelchair user and you can't teach wheelchair skills, all the important wheelchair skills, right, in just one delivery visit. So sometimes it might take a couple of visits in order for training of use of that piece of equipment. You also do not have to accept equipment if there's something wrong. Now, there are some exceptions to this. So it does happen, right? Where maybe a wheelchair gets delivered, for example, and there's a small part that isn't working well. And so you need to get a different part. And you can accept the chair, right? You can sign off for the chair and then work with the PT and vendor to problem solve through getting a different part. Um, but if you get into a wheelchair and it doesn't fit, right? Like if you're in a scenario, for example, where your feet don't fit on the foot plate, you can't get both your feet on the foot plate. That is a problem. There's something wrong with the frame there, and there could have been an error. If it's a child and a lot of time went by, maybe that chair needs some adjustments and some growth to it. And if that can't happen on the delivery, a child shouldn't, or a child or adult, right, shouldn't have a wheelchair where they can't get both feet on the foot plate, right? So if there's something like that that's wrong, you're allowed to say, I'm not accepting this equipment, right? And put it on the PT and the vendor to then take the equipment back and problem solve through fixing it and then rescheduling delivery for a later date. Again, another reason why it's so important to spend the time picking the right therapist who's going to help you throughout the process, because that is a decision that you might not want to make on your own, right? You're going to want a physical therapist who's going to help you problem solve through whether or not you sign for the equipment or don't sign for the equipment. Make sure that you know how to properly use it. Make sure you know how to properly take care of the equipment. Ask how the equipment folds up and breaks down in any way if it does. Make sure that you know what to do in the event of repairs if you're not sure. And also, if it's a power device, make sure that you ask if there are any special instructions for charging the equipment. There's usually some instructions involving charging, especially with new equipment. So make sure that you ask. That information is not always volunteered to you on delivery. So that is the process in and of itself. Some other things I wanted to talk about that I want you guys to look out for when you're going through this process. So I'm very fortunate that I have found some really, really good ATPs and other therapists that I surround myself with that I don't have to worry about these issues because I have people that I trust and I know are good at what they do and are very ethical. However, I have seen it happen, and I've heard a lot of stories. But earlier in my career, as I was finding ATPs and vendors, I've seen these scenarios where there are some not so ethical things happening in the equipment industry, and I think that it's important to just be aware that these things are happening. So it can happen where there's selling of equipment and accessories that are not necessary to make a sale. So if you're in a scenario where I know I keep defaulting to the wheelchair as an example, but it's the piece of equipment that I order the most. So it's oftentimes the example that I keep thinking of. But if you're getting a wheelchair, right? Very commonly less is more, right? More parts can add more weight, which may or may not be an issue for you. Also depending on where it is on the chair. But if you're in a scenario where a vendor is trying to convince you to get a lot of accessories for the chair, no, the scenario could just be that they want you to know your options, and that's great. But also, I have seen it where there have been some vendors who will try to offer you more stuff to sell you more parts. So if something is being offered to you and you're like, I don't need it, it's okay to speak up and say, I don't think I need that part. And if they truly do believe that you need it, they'll be able to give you a good explanation as to why you'll need it. For letter of medical necessity writing, that should not be written by the vendor. That should be written by the therapist. So physical therapist, occupational therapist, speech therapist. No one else should be writing that letter of medical necessity. Also think about who is providing the education, right? What is their motivation? So one of the examples I give here is so when you're in the trial phase for equipment, it's a very common, I do this all the time, right? If someone, say, for example, needs to get a power wheelchair, um, I know the person that knows that power wheelchair the best. Even though I know a lot about power wheelchairs, the person who knows that chair the best is the person who works for that power wheelchair company. So sometimes someone will come to the session who works for the manufacturer. And so know that the person who works for the manufacturer, they're going to know that chair best. They're going to know that brand best. They're going to be able to educate you on that specific chair. So just know if you're asking questions and the manufacturer is answering, they're going to know that brand. So they're not going to be volunteering information to you, right, about, or they shouldn't be, right, about other brands of chairs because they don't know that chair. And if you're ever in a scenario where a manufacturer or someone who works for the manufacturer is hating on another wheelchair, um, you know, that shouldn't be happening either, right? They don't know that wheelchair. They know the wheelchairs for the company that they work for, and that's the wheelchair that they should be speaking to. Again, another reason why it's helpful to find a good therapist who can guide you through this because they can also give you insight as to when that is an issue and when it's not. Um, Equipment should fit upon delivery and accommodate to changes within the near future. So, the example here is for a pediatric wheelchair. So, whenever a child is getting a piece of equipment, so with kids, right, we have to think about growth because kids grow, right? So, you never, ever, ever want to get a piece of equipment for a child to grow into. You're going to give them faulty positioning. It could be unsafe. It can cause an injury. It's also going to make it really hard for them to use that equipment. So the equipment should always fit them upon delivery, but should allow for growth over time. So if you have a child getting a wheelchair, you want to make sure that you pick a wheelchair that fits the patient now, but has the ability to be grown, we say, right, as the child gets bigger. And different chairs grow in different ways. Some chairs, it's a matter of loosening up different parts and moving things around. Sometimes you have to order other accessories and swap out some parts of the chair in order to grow it. But that's something that you want to think about. It's got to fit now and then allow for growth over time. Never get a piece of equipment that's too big for someone with the expectation that they grow into it. That's not okay. And then some other common issues that are happening today. So right now, one of the issues. Now, this also could be something that varies from state to state. I'll say I live in Massachusetts, so if you are listening and you're living outside of Massachusetts or have an insurance outside of Massachusetts, this could vary state to state. But one of the issues that I've been running into a lot has been coding with pieces of equipment. So, another part of this process, right, when a vendor submits to insurance, each piece of equipment is tied to a code, and the reimbursement for that equipment is dependent upon that code. Well, there's some pieces of equipment where the code doesn't exist. So you actually physically can't go through insurance to get that piece of equipment and to actually get the amount of coverage that you need to cover the cost of that piece of equipment. You may hear that if you're trying to order equipment, the vendor could tell you that there's an issue with coding and then help you with figuring out how to problem solve through that. Another thing that's happening today is issues with repairs. I mean, right now, I think, I feel for vendors in the situation where repairs are taking a long time. And it's just a matter of, I don't think it comes from a place of laziness. I think it comes from a place of, there are just there are a lot of equipment companies right now that are understaffed, and it's really hard to do repairs in a timely manner. So my recommendations for navigating this are, if anything needs to be repaired, call your vendor right away. Do not put it off. Don't wait for it to get to a point where it's broken. To the point where now you can't use the chair, or don't put it off until an emergency situation, right? If you notice that something's broken, call right away. Another thing too is ask your vendor, if there's anything that you can do to expedite a repair. So, for example, um, sometimes, right, with vendors, what they'll do to repair is they'll come out to your house, right, to do a repair. But the wait time to get that appointment could be a month or more, right? But ask them, like, if you have the ability to go to them, then tell them, say, listen, if I come to you, if I go to your shop, can you see me quicker, right? Ask them what you can do to help with expediting repairs, and that can help make things go a little bit quicker. Insurance has been pushing back more and more when it comes to pieces of equipment. I mean, there was once a time where I said I've never received a denial for the years and years I've been ordering equipment, and now I feel like I almost have to anticipate that a denial is happening because for a lot of pieces of equipment, not everything, but for a lot of equipment, we're just getting more and more denials, and sometimes it's a matter of like advocacy, right? And resubmitting to insurance. And this is another reason why really good to find the right provider. Because if something's denied, you want to make sure that you have a provider who's going to be on your side, who's going to take the time to figure out why was it denied, how do we go about doing this, what are your options, educating you on what your options are, and supporting you in whatever it is that you decide. But now, if you advocate insurance truly isn't an option, the vendor should be able to help you with figuring out what your out of pocket options are. Um, there are also used equipment companies. And so ask your therapist what is in your area for used equipment. So, for example, in Massachusetts, there's a company called Requipment, and they take used equipment and they offer it up to someone else who needs it for free. And for a very, very small fee, they'll actually deliver the piece of equipment to you. So I've been in some scenarios where people needed equipment and they were able to find it on the Requipment website. That's also it's also handy to have this information regardless of insurance coverage, because another time I've used equipment companies is if say it's someone's first wheelchair and they need a wheelchair, and sometimes the vendor can give you a loaner chair to use in the meantime while you're waiting for your chair. But sometimes they don't have one available. And so you might get a used wheelchair, which isn't going to be the best, right? But it's something just to get you by in the meantime until your chair comes in. And the PT can help you, your PT can help you figure that as well. So another thing that you can do with getting used equipment is sometimes you can actually get used equipment from a manufacturer. So I've been in this scenario where someone needed a power assist system. They couldn't get it through insurance because of an insurance requirement where they needed to have the chair for 1 year, but they really needed the power assist system. And so what we asked the manufacturer who makes that power assist system if they have any used power assist systems, maybe that they've used for demos for people to try, that they'd be willing to sell at a discounted price. And the manufacturer actually sold them something at a discounted price. So or offer to sell them something at a discounted price. And then from there, you can figure out if you want to take them up on that option. So there are options out there for used equipment. Just ask your PT and your vendor, just because it's not always information that people are volunteering. Grant funding. I've seen people get equipment, especially recreational equipment. In Massachusetts, recreational adaptive equipment isn't typically covered by insurance. So that's an example of when families have been successful with getting grant funding in this area. And then also, if your child, sometimes you can do funding through the school. You just have to be careful because if the school pays for it, the school owns it. So there are times when you can take that route, but I'm not commonly seeing that happen. A couple other issues I want to touch upon are clinician pressure to refer within. So if you have a physical therapist already and you need a piece of equipment, it's very common that people will use their physical therapist. Make sure that you have an open and honest conversation with your PT if you are going to use them, because sometimes, clinicians, there's a pressure to refer within and help someone with equipment, even if they feel like they don't have the skill set to do it. Same thing with a lot of big hospital systems. Oftentimes there's a pressure to refer within the hospital system. So just make sure you have an honest conversation about what your options are. So that way you are working with the best provider who can help you with what you need. All PTs have their specialties, and it's okay if you're working with a couple of therapists to get a couple of different things. I actually use that model very, very frequently with my patients, where they might have more than one PT because different PTs have different specialties. And then closing note is another issue is I think, is a lack of encouragement to switch providers and or vendors if you need to. So just like with any clinician, really, if you are unhappy with your clinician, find a new one. If you're I mean, this doesn't even, I mean, this isn't even just for equipment, right? This is for anything. If you're working with a provider and you're not happy with them, you're allowed to find somebody else. And it's okay. It could be for any reason. Maybe they're just not the right fit for you. Maybe they're too far away from you, right? And you need to find someone who's closer to you. For whatever the reason is, know that that is okay. And it's okay to switch providers if you feel like you're not getting what you need for yourself or your child or whoever it is that you're helping. And that's okay. So thank you very much for listening. I really appreciate it. So, like I said, so my name is Jenna Rawhead. Feel free to use me as a resource if you guys have any questions. Always feel free to reach out. My email address is here on this last slide. You can also go to my website. I am also on Instagram, so please follow me at Rawhead Physical Therapy on Instagram. And please email me if you have any feedback or ideas for future presentations. My plan is to add more videos to this channel in the future. So I'm always looking for feedback from people to figure out what videos do you want and what is going to be the most helpful to you. I truly believe that knowledge is power, and I think that by educating other people on different equipment related things, that it will help them with the use of their equipment and getting the equipment that they need. So please reach out if you have any ideas or if you have any feedback for me. Thanks so much.